this partnership is because we share similar principles. The University of Winchester believes in social justice and compassion in order to make a difference in the world. And Rodemos el Diálogo also believes in the importance of 6 principles in order to build a culture of dialogue to build peace in Colombia and across the world. These principles of Rodemos of dialogue, these principles of dialogue are the following. First, generosity, in order to take this hour and a half and make the most of this space with the people who have decided to join this dialogue. The second principle is solidarity, to understand the needs of others and that in this space we can take them into account. The third principle is co-responsibility, and is that we all have a role to play in building peace, regardless of the position and the place where we are. The fourth principle is honesty, that we invite you in this space to be aware that we don't know every single thing and that this is a really good source of humbleness. The fifth principle is respect. We know that we all have different cognitive and cultural biases, and because of that, we can always be wary of the different positions and ideas and needs that people have. And finally, the sixth principle is self-criticism, and we invite you all to critically reflect on some of our prejudices that we have and some of the imperfect ideas that we usually hold, and with that we can have a really meaningful interaction in this critical dialogue on reconciliation. So the idea is that in this space we embrace these principles and we can have a dialogue between people who are in different places in the world with different paths in life. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our guest speakers today. I'm delighted to be joined here by Rachel Klogg. She works at Conciliation Resources. She led the Caucasus program for 15 years. She worked with local partners for most of that time, and now she supports the team and partners in an advisory capacity. She leads Conciliation Resources work on Georgia and Armenia, and she is has facilitated different types of cross-conflict dialogue, including the current Limehouse discussion platform. Before joining Conciliation Resources as staff, she was fellow at St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford, and she was lecturing in Russian also there. And she holds a PhD at the University of Oxford on politics, literature, and identity. I'm also joined by Michelle Parliev, who is a consultant for Conciliation Resources. She's been an independent consultant and practitioner and peace process facilitator. She has 25 years of experience in design, facilitation of dialogue, strategic reflection and learning processes, and she has worked on community, national and international levels in Southern and East Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Europe. Her experiences focuses on peace building, conflict prevention, human rights, access to justice, transitional justice, and development. She has served as a senior conflict transformation officer for the Danish foreign minister in Nepal. At the end of the civil war, she has also worked for the World Bank. She has worked for the Center for Conflict Resolution in South Africa. And she has co-facilitated 4 multi-stakeholder dialogues on criminal justice in the Netherlands as a senior associate of Reus Partners. And she has co-authored a really important and interesting policy briefing on reconciliation in peacebuilding practice produced by Conciliation Resources together with Rachel Klogg. So I'm delighted to have Michelle and Rachel here today. Before we start this dialogue with Rachel and Michelle, I would like just to let you all know a bit of how we are going to run the dialogue today. The idea of dialogue is to be a flexible space for thinking together. This is not a seminar. This is not a panel of experts. This is a space to think together. So I invite you to all engage in this dialogue in that capacity. The first 30 minutes, Rachel, Michelle, and I, we try to help a dialogue. We invite you to listen. We invite you to let your thoughts flow with ideas that have been shared in that moment. And please don't drop questions in the chat or comments. Allow your own thought process to evolve. Then I will open a space for a collective dialogue. This collective dialogue will last for 25 minutes. Please be aware that this event is being live streamed on YouTube, and we are asking you and inviting you to join the dialogue by turning your cameras on and asking your questions or making your comments or sharing your ideas, that they don't need to be perfectly defined in that space for us to think together. Finally, once we have done these 45 minutes, I will wrap up in 5 minutes, trying to offer some food for thought for the next the critical dialogues on reconciliation. As you all know, this is a space where we have invited practitioners, scholars, and students of reconciliation for all of us to try to critically think about such an important issue today. So with that in mind, let me turn to Rachel first, and I would like to ask Rachel a question in order for us to start this dialogue. Rachel, I've read this policy briefing. It's a fantastic policy briefing. It offers many insights on the relationship between reconciliation and peace-building practice. But I guess the first point to entry this is to ask you, why has Conciliation Resources decided to publish this policy briefing in this particular moment in time?
Thank you, Andre. And just to say, really pleased to be in this environment, able to think together in this format and with the other participants. Why now? I think it's quite a simple answer to your question. It's because it was possible now. The paper really draws on insights from practice that we've gathered within CR's own practice, Conciliation Resources practice. We began probably about 10, 11 years ago with work on dealing with the past in the South Caucasus, practical work on the ground. We had some work also in Colombia around that time, but really over the last decade or so, the interest in doing this kind of work and the multiple different ways in which it's being done across different geographical contexts at Conciliation Resources has really grown. We've had a number of kind of internal learning workshops. I think the first was back in 2013. Michelle was involved in that, looking at the intersection of human rights, peace building, and I think the question of some of us call it dealing with the past, some of us call it reconciliation, but what that means in conflict contexts for the future has really come up in a lot of different ways. And so we wanted to try to better understand, what does this mean for our peace building practice, and really make sense of it for ourselves and gather some lessons learned. So in 2020, we had a small peace research partnership grant from the UK government that it really focuses on reconciliation in relation to programming and policy on conflict. And this gave us the opportunity to canvass experience within the organisation and outside, some interviews, a workshop, really gathering examples from practice. It also enabled us to distill some lessons from a publication that we produced in 2016 called the Accord Insight, Transforming Broken Relationships, Making Peace with the Past. And that had looked at 4 different contexts and was very much based on practice. But what we wanted to do in this paper was to produce something that was much more practically applicable. And we set out to answer some really quite simple questions that proved really not very simple to try to find answers to. But how is reconciliation understood? How is it talked about in very different contexts? What's the relationship between reconciliation and peace? And just some very practical kind of when, what, how questions. I should say it was written very much from a practitioner's perspective. It's not intended to be, nor is it definitive or comprehensive. It's not based on widespread research. It's really trying to distill learning and open up lines of inquiry for discussion. So it's really good to have the opportunity in this context. Now, I wanted just to say a little bit, because we couldn't get away from using a working definition of reconciliation. Recognizing reconciliation means very different things to different people. It's a very contested term in many contexts. And of course, this work is highly context specific. There's no formal or widely accepted definition, but we really wanted to come up with something that would help us to understand that how we were framing our inquiry. Michelle, if you could share the little diagram. We came up with a number of kind of visual aids, as it were, while we were working on the publication, to help us understand what we were talking about. So we, in coming up with a definition, a working definition, we talk about reconciliation involving rebuilding and re is in brackets, so building or rebuilding, and or transforming relationships damaged by violent conflict and oppression. And the way that we've captured it in this diagram, it sees reconciliation working across 3 timeframes, and these are very much kind of interlocking timeframes. So there's work around developing a fair, mutually acceptable and interdependent future. We chose that wording very carefully as opposed to shared future, and we can maybe talk about that at a later stage. There's also work that is around acknowledging, addressing the past, dealing with the legacy of past violence, and that can be work around accountability and justice issues. Justice really runs throughout, but both of these 2 timeframes, kind of looking forward and looking back, are taking place in the present and are helping to reframe the present. And within this sort of inner circle, we have different dimensions of the kind of relational change that is going on. There's work that is operating at a vertical level around the social contract, building vertical relationships between people, citizens groups and state, or institutions, formal institutions, informal institutions. But we also see relationships being built horizontally, and issues around social cohesion, trust, peaceful coexistence. So really fostering significant cultural attitudinal change and establishing new norms. So this was the framing that we chose as we went forward to talk about reconciliation. Michelle, if you can stop sharing now, I think that's probably enough. And I just wanted to say a couple of words about the connotations that the term itself has. There's actually another diagram that Michelle worked on that is, I think, quite a useful guide that takes you through the evolution of different terms that are often quite overlapping or understood in very different ways. Reconciliation, transitional justice, dealing with the past, transformative justice. So that's I'm not going to speak to this, don't worry, and please do look it up if you're interested. But that shows you the evolution of how the term has generally been defined, how it's emerged, how it's contributed to the field, and indeed what the limitations are of these different terms. Michelle, thank you. But just to say that we're really conscious that reconciliation as a term itself can often have negative connotations. It's a difficult concept for both of us in our practical work. It can often be used for political expediency. It can be seen as a soft touch, avoiding issues of justice, impunity, kind of patching things together as opposed to really fundamentally transforming them. And it can be seen as understanding as wanting to return to the status quo ante, kind of putting things back together, which can be very threatening to people in some conflict contexts. And all I wanted to say on this is that where the term is contested, it can actually be a useful source of dialogue. We've had this in the context of my work in the Caucasus. It's really the meaning that matters, and it's about coming up collectively with a meaning that enables you to push the boundaries of what is possible. And in fact, we found that this definitional ambiguity, we don't want to get caught up on definitions of reconciliation. The ambiguity, in a sense, can really help practitioners. You can use terms tactically, depending on the context, and choose the framing that works for you in the particular context. And this is one of the really, really key learning points, is that it is very context specific. I just wanted to share two more brief learning points from practice that we reflected in the paper. And one of the reasons that we really wanted to put this out there, because we found in practice that it really is not the case that reconciliation is used exclusively in a post-agreement phase, that really reconciliation is possible at all stages of the conflict cycle. Now, what you can do, the impact it can have, who can be involved, these, of course, all vary, and where you're at in a conflict context really does matter. But we have found that it is possible to begin this work, and it is indeed happening in multiple different ways at very different stages in conflict. It's difficult and it's sensitive and it's highly political work, but it is possible to make it happen. And one final thing that we've been reflecting on, and we'd be really interested actually in feedback around the notion that the type of conflict context has an impact on how you can conceive and frame reconciliation. So there are dynamics at play, say, in a self-determination or secessionist conflict that differs from an intrastate conflict. I won't say more now because I know we are short on time, and we can develop some of this as we go along, but that's my starter.
Thanks, Rachel. I mean, listening to you, and because of your long, sort of expertise and practical experience, I want to ask you something related with the fact of thinking that this is the connection between reconciliation and peace building is something that is happening more now than before. I mean, you work in Conciliation Resources, which is a peace building organization. And so before, I mean, in the last 25 years or 20 years, was reconciliation an important aspect of peace building? Or was it considered an important element when you, for example, were working in the Caucasus? Or was it a secondary element of peace building, and now this sort of policy briefing is bringing it to the fore and saying, no, we need to think about this connection between peace building practice and reconciliation more seriously?
I think that's a really interesting question. I would argue from where I'm sitting now, and that is kind of with the wisdom of hindsight, that reconciliation work is really fundamental to peace building. And I think, we try and pull this out also in the paper, that it is about addressing kind of core underlying issues. It's about working with the legacies of past violence that can create real obstacles for moving forward. And in many ways, it's very overlapping with peace building work. It focuses on the relational element of peace building work, and on, as we would understand it, very, very much a kind of transformative process that is about structural relationships and structural change as well. So I find it quite difficult to distinguish reconciliation as such from peace building. I think, you can look at peace building as more issues-based and reconciliation as more relationship-based, but I don't think you can do one without the other. What I think has changed, certainly if I think back to when we first started in the Georgian-Abkhaz conflict context, which is the area that I've most focused on, 10, 11 years ago, it was very difficult to talk about work on dealing with the past in a context of protracted conflict, where settlement was really a very long way off. There was a lot of association of work on dealing with the past, or reconciliation. We don't call it reconciliation, and I can come on to why not in that context. But there was a lot of talk about reconciliation being all about transitional justice. And in this context, in the absence of an agreed legal or political framework, no point at which you can draw a line in the sand and say the past is in the past, opening up these kind of issues felt really difficult and potentially quite risky, kind of reopening old wounds. It was very difficult to get donor funding support for it. And when I first started to kind of explore what do we mean by dealing with the past work, I came up against a lot of kind of terminology, a lot of very kind of legalistic talk around justice, which is of course a hugely important component part. But we, together with partners, started to explore what can be possible. Not so much because we thought we should be doing something on reconciliation, but because within the dialogue processes that we were involved in, the past kept coming up. It was present, and it was clearly dictating the politics and the dynamics around the conflict. The positions of the parties were kind of underpinned by these very entrenched dominant narratives that were quite mutually exclusive and would appeal back to the past. So it's a really sort of deep-rooted identity issues, and we felt that we couldn't avoid it, and so if you can't avoid it, then you have to try and find a way of addressing it in a more constructive and a more inclusive way. We had a lot of conversation and dialogue about what we mean by dealing with the past and reconciliation in a context like that. And it is particularly in relation to self-determination or secessionist conflicts that we found it really hard when you're talking about improving relationships prior to political settlement, but when one side of that relationship saw reconciliation as akin to reintegration, that the parties getting closer was seen as much more in the political interest of one side than the other, and because of the power dynamics involved, it made it very difficult. There were real fears about reconciliation as returning things to how they were. But what I think enabled us to move forward was some of the dialogue that we had together. One of our Abkhaz colleagues came up with an image of a vase, and I find this a really useful image to hold on to, that if you have a vase and it's shattered by violent conflict, it's in pieces on the floor, then when you talk about reconciliation, you're not picking up those pieces and sticking them together into a vase that has the same fault lines that it had before. You need to look at that as something that has happened, and then together to try to build a new vase, and one that is much more robust, and one that is built on different principles, if you like. And I think that tipping point in our dialogue process made it possible for us to work on this. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think we've found that we have to do this work, and then we've tried to find a way of understanding it and making sense of what reconciliation is in relation to peace building, if you see what I mean.
And I do think it's fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. And I think you help us to move and to invite this moment to the dialogue to Michelle. Because Michelle, we've been talking about, like sort of a working definition, that we don't want to get stuck into a definition of reconciliation, that this, sort of having constructive ambiguity in order to have a dialogue about reconciliation. And now Rachel has shared a bit of, in practice, how working on reconciliation is necessary and how it is connected to peace building. And I guess the policy briefing is a really interesting document in which you also offer some ideas on what does reconciliation involve in practice. So I guess I would like to ask you and to invite you now to join to tell us a bit of what are the key takeaway points of the policy briefing, probably engaging how to do this reconciliation work, how is this connected to issues of timing that Rachel has also spoken about, and all these other elements that you have put together in this very thought-provoking policy briefing.
Thanks very much, Andre. Thanks indeed for inviting us and me to speak on this and engage with others. I really like the notion of thinking along with others. I think something that's been quite uncomfortable for Rachel and myself is this notion that because we've been writing this and dived into it, that suddenly now we might be experts on this, which is totally besides where we are coming at this from. It's really still a learning process, and you will probably relate to the notion of the deeper you dive into a topic, the more questions kind of emerge, and the more you know how much you don't know, in a way. So, and perhaps in that sense, let me also immediately kind of push back on how to do this in practice, because one thing in looking at learning from practice and what does this mean for practice, we were quite concerned of being asked to kind of provide a blueprint or a template for this is how you do this, the 10-step guide to reconciliation, which I think is something that we would be very uncomfortable with, partly because it is so contextual. So when you speak about a key takeaway for how to do this in practice, yes, you can look at other experiences, and you'll see in many countries that there has been a kind of learning process of what has been done elsewhere. But then still, it very much depends on what is relevant in that context, and who do you engage with in that context, and what do actors within that context highlight, and what is the space available to work on reconciliation that really kind of determines what you can do and how you can do that. So that for me is one real takeaway in terms of practice. It really, really matters that you start with the context, and hence also the notion of paying attention to culture, paying attention to language, what language, when the term of reconciliation is used, who's using it and to what end, because very often there is a political agenda behind a particular notion of reconciliation that benefits some and not others. And it's useful, especially if you are an outsider working in a context, it's very useful to kind of keep in mind what is the notion that's put forth here, what's the understanding, and who benefits and who doesn't. I think another element that is important to keep in mind when working on reconciliation in practice is really realizing that this is first and foremost a political thing. And you hear from Rachel when initially starting to look at dealing with the past, that she encountered a lot of more legalistic kind of elements. And in a way that also perhaps speaks to your earlier question, why now and why not earlier? Initially, the questions around dealing with the past was very much seen, I think, in the domain of human rights and justice. And it's increasingly been associated with international criminal justice and criminal accountability. And I think over the last 10 years, we've increasingly seen that both in the policy world, but in the practice world as well, the lines between these different disciplines is far less clear cut than we like to think, say, for example, from an academic perspective. So working on justice, you can perhaps pursue from a very particular legal justice-oriented point of view, but justice is also about fairness and equality and how people are treated and how people get to have a say in decisions that affect their lives. So the very notion that building or working on relationship building in both a horizontal and a vertical sense, that is political because it also relates to issues of power. And how, for example, institutions of governance relate to citizens, for example, and how governance structures are set up so that some communities may benefit more than others. I think some other key takeaway points were highlighted by Rachel in terms of how recognizing how specific conflict dynamics may surface particular questions. So some of the conflict contexts that I've been working in, notably South Africa, Zimbabwe, Northern Ireland, Nepal, they were all intrastate conflicts. So there you're speaking about, if you think about envisioning a future, you're much more thinking of envisioning a shared future, where in a way former enemies have to make do with one another within a common territorial space. The kind of successionist conflict context that Rachel brought to our conversation is a very different context, where indeed reconciliation might be perceived by some as in fact being a different ploy to further projects of reintegration, which is far from what certain people want. And for the paper, we also engaged with practitioners in Libya, where you can speak more of kind of a hybrid or a proxy conflict where there's such involvement of international powers that there are questions of accountability and ownership of processes in relation to reconciliation becomes much more to the surface. So the very notion of kind of taking into account conflict dynamics and what that means for how you work on reconciliation, I think is an important insight from the paper. And that perhaps brings me to another element, and that is kind of builds on something you were saying earlier, Andre, indeed. I think one of my learnings from the paper is around also moving away from trying to determine what reconciliation is and what it is not, and how it equates or differs from peace building. Those are kind of definitional debates that I don't think necessarily get us much further. I've increasingly started thinking more on what is necessary, how do we create conditions in which something akin to reconciliation, where that kind of relationship building and the transformation of relationships might actually happen. So who do we need to engage with? How do you get people together? What is the kind of preparatory work that needs to happen, perhaps on the side separately, before you engage with one another? And linked to that then also is the question of, I mean, our paper in a way is perhaps one of the few things I've seen where we explicitly link the notion of conflict sensitivity to reconciliation work. In other words, you can't just assume that because you work on reconciliation, it by definition will be sensitive to conflict dynamics in a given context. You do need to take into account how your work kind of feeds into existing conflict dynamics. So for me, there's been a number of different things that I've found very useful. And I think a final kind of practical point that I want to add in here as well, I think is the notion, it relates again to context, but also around how needs relating to reconciliation might change over time. So South Africa is a prime example on that. The way reconciliation was understood in the 90s is quite different from how it's looked at today. But also that reconciliation is very often relevant to contexts that we don't necessarily think of when we talk about reconciliation. And now I'm referring to, for example, the context of my own country, the Netherlands, or Rachel's country, the UK, where reconciliation, we tend to think of reconciliation as only relevant, or often particularly relevant, to contexts which have an experience and a legacy of political violence. And in the context of both the UK and the Netherlands, that political violence isn't particularly present within, say, the European context, but our countries and our predecessors, in a way, ancestors, have been involved in political violence in territories far away. And that kind of colonial legacy is something to be reckoned with as well, increasingly, I think, and can be looked at through the prism of reconciliation. And I think that's something we haven't expanded on in the paper, but certainly the paper allows for that, so to say. So let me leave with this here.
Thank you, Michelle. I mean, really fascinating what you're saying, and so many takeaway points that you have put really clearly to us, and it makes me think about my own country, Colombia, and the reasons why we're having these conversations, at least on the side of Rodemos el Diálogo, is precisely because this is very timely. And you've said something that is really powerful, and I want to take it from there and ask you a follow-up question. I mean, in a way, you said reconciliation is political. We cannot deny that it's political, and there are so many actors, and Rachel was speaking about it, and you have somehow also mentioned this, that the way how reconciliation is perceived in some contexts has negative tint, and that makes it very difficult to work on reconciliation, and is part of the political dimension of reconciliation. So I guess one of the question that I want to ask you is in terms of something that also you mentioned towards the end of the policy briefing, and is how to build momentum for reconciliation when you have this adverse political context, I guess. And I think this is quite important because probably we have some policymakers here, and we're constantly thinking about, what are the implications for policy of this that we are saying in this particular moment. So it'd be really good to hear, some thoughts that you might have on this. And once Michelle has answered this question, I just want to invite you all to start, putting your hands up so that I can invite you to join the floor to either ask a question to Michelle or to Rachel, or to make a comment, or, you don't need to come with very sophisticated ideas, but what we want to try to do, as we have said here, is this is some initial food for thought for all of us to try to think together with some of these ideas that we put on the table. So, Michelle, over to you before we open the floor to everyone else.
Great. And let me indeed immediately kind of throw that question to all of you who are listening. The question of how to build momentum for reconciliation in adverse political circumstances. I'd be very interested to get comments from more people than just myself. I think, and I'm thinking particularly now of two contexts, and one being Sri Lanka and one being Zimbabwe. Sri Lanka, where I'm not an expert on Sri Lanka. I haven't worked in Sri Lanka. I've done quite a bit of reading on Sri Lanka, and we've engaged with some people working on Sri Lanka in the context of working on this paper. Certainly, the political conditions for working on this stuff have become increasingly dire. The space for civil society activists has become increasingly limited. And obviously, and Corona in a way has provided government with additional opportunities to kind of curtail that space and limit gatherings. And then the question really is perhaps not so much how to build momentum for it, but at least keep the conversation alive in small and limited spaces. And I think, again, that very much depends on context. But even the very notion of some people continuing to kind of keep thinking about this and keep preparing for this. Years ago, I was invited by a civil society group of diaspora as activists from Syria who were starting to think about this stuff. And this is many years ago. We all know that there hasn't been a change in Syria in terms of government. But there is something to creating pockets of conversation and dialogue and thinking about this even in adverse conditions. And of course, that is important to take into account also what that means in terms of security and safety considerations, what that implies in terms of what do you speak about and how do you make sure that people don't get extensively exposed. But sometimes there's the thinking, and certainly I think perhaps more from a policy perspective, what is the right moment? And in conflict resolution, there's this whole notion of the ripe moment. I think the notion of a ripe moment is not necessarily so useful because it kind of always puts the moment of action at some moments that often only afterwards you can determine might have been particularly ripe. So it's more, for me, it's more around how do you kind of seize opportunities as and when they arrive. And even if that only initially entails engaging with small groups of people, and keep that going and build that into somewhere. But I'd be very interested to hear what other people would say around this. And again, actually, if I may just add to that, we think of adverse political conditions, and that's also clearly my own being self-reflective. That's clearly also my own frame of reference. I think of Syria, I think of Sri Lanka. But it's also important to think about adverse political conditions where you deal with a majority view and a minority view. So going back to the whole colonial legacy in a context like the Netherlands, or perhaps the UK, but Rachel is better placed to comment on that. The conditions aren't particularly adverse in terms of politics, but in terms of dominant consensus within society, for a vast majority of Dutch people dealing with the colonial legacy, why should we? Why would we? Because this has often been so relegated to the periphery of the political agenda that for a vast number of Dutch people, this is like, why should we be dealing with this? Why does this matter to our country to date or to how we engage with one another in society? And so the adversity and the resistance to engaging with these questions may not only exist in kind of serious kind of political violent context, but may also exist in more subliminal ways, so to say, where there's much more kind of underground latent reluctance to deal with questions around what is it that we are responsible for and how does that continue to affect how we engage today with one another.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, I think we have had lots of food for thought here, and this is the moment in which we will open up the floor for people to jump in. Probably we need a moment to digest a bit what we have said, but please put your hands up or please write me on the chat so that I can really give you the opportunity to start sharing your ideas with us. I just probably want to say before the first person jumps in that in the case of the work that we were doing in Embrace Dialogue in Colombia, until very recently, we were quite skeptical of using the word reconciliation. We wanted to focus on the implementation of the peace agreement, which had, transitional justice measures, redistributive measures on land. It had topics of security, guarantees for human rights defenders. But the whole idea was, you do you implement all those stipulations, but you don't really talk about reconciliation because it sounds like too big. It sounds like you cannot impose that. It sounds like you get there without naming it too much, because if you name it too much, then it becomes instrumentalized. But I think something that Rachel has said and Michelle has really started to become an important aspect of our work. And is this idea that you cannot just implement these stipulations without talking about the importance of rebuilding relations. And that aspect, the relational aspect of reconciliation, that is so important, that is part of the stipulations, is something that we are more conscious about it. And I think that this idea that you have shared now, that it'd be so important to listen to other people, what they think about, but I think that when you name something so clearly, like reconciliation is political, then it allows you to engage easier with it, because then you are not afraid of it anymore. You don't try to believe or to promote the idea that reconciliation is something outside politics, but actually it is part of politics, and that of course people takes these positions around reconciliation because it's the political nature of the very journey towards reconciliation. So anyway, just to say that, to add something else in this thought-provoking discussion, and I can see that now Camilo would like to ask or make a comment, and I invite the rest to start joining this dialogue. So Camilo, over to you.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Rachel. It has been a very interesting dialogue. I was particularly moved by the idea of a reconciliation not being something that happened after the end of an armed conflict. And particularly in Colombia, that's a very important idea, because when one proposes reconciliation, one frequently gets answered, well, but we have to end the war, and it's a war that seems to always change more than end. And one ends it with one actor, and then it starts with or continues with other actors that become stronger. And so I would like to go on with that idea, or to reflect on that idea. And the other thing I would want to ask is, how do you see the relationship, understanding reconciliation as something political, between polarization and reconciliation, which is also a very Colombian problem right now, as to how can you rebuild relationships when there is the dehumanization of, not only caused by war, but also caused by politics.
That's great. Thanks, Camilo. Thanks for adding a topic here on polarization and reconciliation. Pirus, over to you.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Is that good?
Perfect.
Okay. I have two little questions. The first one is, would you consider that what happened in Germany after the Second World War was about reconciliation, because it was, the Nuremberg trial dealt with 30 people or 24 people, and all the rest of the Nazi I don't know how to say it, leaders were in their house and they didn't really respond for what they did. And I believe that some of my German friends are still shocked about that, and they say, okay, that in some families they speak very freely about what Nazism is about, and they still feel free with it. So it's not so. Is that part of what you would work on when a country has completely changed something? They're in peace, but still there are some people who are the seeds of what would go wrong afterwards. This is my first question. I'm not if it's really clear, but the second is, if you begin to do a reconciliation work beforehand, in anticipation, like in Syria or Iran or other countries like that, what type of way would you work? Would that be in an agile way to just begin some small talks and then see what happens and then build again together where to go, knowing that the powers are very strong and the political powers are very strong and would try to go their way and manipulate this? Or would you work on putting down some criteria and say, okay, there's a criteria like justice, and what would you say about justice? What are the main points of values of the country about justice? And so that once these are settled, people can work very freely and would speak freely about what they have to do afterwards. I don't know if I'm very clear.
Thank you, Piers. That's like your two questions, comments are really useful to continue moving in this idea of this dialogue. I saw that also Jeremy Cunningham, who has worked on Sri Lanka, has told me that he would like to share some ideas of his research. So Jeremy, would you like to jump in and give us some input into this dialogue?
Well, obviously my ears pricked up when I heard Michelle mention Sri Lanka, because the last bit of practical field research I did was in Sri Lanka. This is just to share some thoughts about the past, because I'm a historian by background and a human rights activist by kind of action in daily life. I was interested to see what the schools were teaching about the different cultural experiences in Sri Lanka and about the war and so on. And since I had previously been in Uganda, an overwhelmingly Christian country, and I was now in an Asian culture, and since I know Japan very well, I'm married to a Japanese person and I've studied a lot of Japanese history and lived in Japan. I have some thoughts about Christian background parts of the world and Asian backgrounds parts of the world in attitude to the past. And I found myself wondering in Uganda, where there are a lot of Catholics, about confession and also about the Western tradition of psychotherapy and repression, where this strong premise is that telling the truth is good for the soul or good for the mind. And if you repress the truth, it's going to burst out in violence or damage of some kind. And in the Catholic tradition, confession has a part in putting things right. But it seemed to me that Buddhist traditions or Hindu traditions or even Confucian traditions, there may be a tradition where the past should be forgotten, where we use the word a lot, reopening old wounds, and it made me think of things like scars or repair. And so in Sri Lanka particularly, I did find myself wondering whether there's a tradition there. And of course, I've been in Cambodia as well and did a little research in Cambodia about history and the past. And there again, I came up with this kind of let the past, bury the past, let's bury the bones, forget about this. This is dangerous, raking up these things. And it had a lot of resonance as I was starting to think about education, because education in many countries is actually indoctrination. And the uses of people in power, uses of schools to force people to take on a particular narrative. So I'm just throwing those into the discussion because I think they may add something as we particularly deal with the truth part of reconciliation and handling the past. So that's just a thought.
Great, Jeremy. I think this is a good moment to either Michelle or Rachel to invite you to, as we said, this is not about answering questions or doing like a formal Q&A, but what is it coming to your minds after listening these really 3 or 4 really interesting, interventions in this dialogue? So Michelle, over to you.
So I think a couple of things came to mind listening. And it's really interesting what you bring up, Jeremy, the link with Christianity. And that's certainly an element that was also raised in the South African context when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission got underway. Partly also because clergy played such a strong role in terms of the body, the commissioners themselves of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's interesting to highlight that the whole notion of truth-telling initially, as far as I know, came up in the Latin American context, especially in contexts where, like Argentina, where disappearances were the dominant mode of human rights violation. Now, disappearances of people exist by the grace of silence and denial. So telling the truth and bringing the truth to light was, in that sense, a very direct countermeasure to that silence and denial. And where the South African Commission made a kind of progressed from the bodies that had preceded it in the Latin American context was making the discussions and the meetings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the hearings truly a public forum rather than something that happens in camera, as a way of breaking open the atmosphere of denial that exists around apartheid crimes in the South African context. And I'll use it in a way to jump to Perusa's comment. But I think and this is where I think that our emphasis on contextualization is so important, because the very notion that, say, the little work I did in relation or in support of Syrian activists, I was invited to do some work with them. But I would be very loath to say I have a good idea for work with Syrian activists. I'm not a Syrian activist. I'm not particularly focused and in-depth knowledgeable about the country. So it is first and foremost people from within a context that work out for themselves what may be relevant and needed in their context. And in that sense, the very notion that, so even if there's maybe a very strong cultural tradition of letting the past lie or not speaking about difficult stuff, I mean, I can tell you that certainly in the context of Nepal, where Hinduism is a very strong kind of cultural and religious tradition, certainly members of families of disappeared persons are very keen on getting clarity on what happened to their loved ones. So I think it is important to recognize usually the voices of victims do surface at some point or another. There may not be space for them in the political arena, but that doesn't mean they're not there. And that perhaps, so I think a direct line from one particular religious or cultural tradition to asking questions about the past or wanting clarity about the past is quite difficult to make in practice. And that then perhaps brings me to Peruse's question about the Nuremberg trials, whether or not that was reconciliation. I think I would like to sidestep that as part of my saying I'm not sure that it's useful to really focus on what is it and what is it not. What I do think is relevant in that context is to what extent has Germany and other countries where there has been support for the Nazis, have there been conversations within society in a broader base about how did these conditions come about where this enormous immensity of violence could actually happen? What were the conditions? What was the complicity of people? And that, I think, is something that has happened to a limited extent in the South African context. And this is where the danger for me comes up with these formal mechanisms, be they trials or be they truth and reconciliation commissions. The mandates of these bodies highlight focus on very specific human rights violations. So that meant that in the South African context, many people could kind of say, yeah, but I wasn't involved in torture or abduction or severe ill treatment. That was the police or the members of the military, the kind of bad apple or the rotten egg theory. But in a way that kind of moves away from a discussion, how did white society in South Africa benefit as a whole and uphold apartheid for so many years, voting for the South African apartheid regime with ever larger numbers for many years. And I think that those are the conversations that are important to have when we talk about rebuilding relationships or building new relationships where they didn't exist before.
Thanks, Michelle. I mean, I see that Rachel wants to come back. Listening to Michelle and thinking a bit about this question about forgetting, and one of the things that came to my mind is I just came back from a county in Colombia called Caquetá, where we've seen like some of the reincorporation zones that have been created for the FARC, and the FARC is engaging with some communities doing some demining actions. And one of the things that was very striking for me, and now I make this connection, is that I did some interviews with people who were very Catholic or Christian, deeply religious, and it was striking to see how they didn't mention the past at all. They have dealt with it. I mean, for them, it was not important to talk about what had happened 20, 30 years before, but for them, what was really, really important was what is the state doing for us to have better life now, better economic, social conditions, so that we can live in the countryside and we can have a future for our generations. And I think that's the reason why the working definition that you have is so useful, because it's not saying let's only deal with the past. It's saying these relationships that are part of the social contract between a state and the communities are absolutely fundamental, because for some people the impossibility of rebuild social relations is not related to the past but to the present, because there are not economic policies that make it possible and there is not willingness from the state to move this process forward. Anyway, sorry, I just jumped in, but Rachel, over to you.
That's really helpful, Andre, and I think it helps to tease out the very different ways. I mean, the fact that the issues that are on the table in relation to reconciliation change over time as well. And this question of forgetting or remembering and what do we understand by the truth is something that I really grapple with. And I know that it is very, very different in different cultural contexts. Some of our colleagues working in the Pacific, they talk about this almost kind of social contract to not talk about the past, and that there are ways of leaving that behind. Whereas in the context that I work in the former Soviet Union, the conversation about the past is so much about these kind of unaddressed injustices and a sense of grievance that will not go away and is preventing progress towards some kind of different future. And so it's almost as though there's an imperative to address it in some form or other. I just wanted to come back to the question at the beginning of that round around the timing, and this kind of until you can end the war, you can't reconcile logic, and it's something that we've come up against a lot, and I find myself saying that actually, if you're in an environment where you can't see an end to conflict, and it's so protracted that that settlement or an end to the conflict is so far off, you're still living with the broken relationships and this legacy of violence or oppression. And if you can't find ways of starting to deal with that, then you're not going to get to the point ultimately where you can really have a sustainable and just outcome of whatever form of kind of mediated settlement there might be. And this question of polarization is one that really vexes me as well, because in an environment where enemy images and the sort of fears of the other are so dominant, starting to talk about a kind of more multifaceted understanding of what happened. And I think this is really where it's critical, actually, that there's a societal conversation about how things came to be as they were, and a sort of self-critical reflection, if you like, around culpability and around really trying to understand from multiple different perspectives. If you can't bridge these very sort of polarized environments to have that conversation, then maybe you have to take a step back. Some of the work, I didn't really talk about the practice of what we're doing in the South Caucasus, but started very slowly documenting kind of existing materials, press, personal diaries, photographs, things that people had kind of in boxes under their beds, and digitizing that in two separate archives on either side of the conflict. They're not linked, they're built according to similar structures, and then starting to take testimonies from people. And for the first 5 years of doing this work that my colleagues and partners were leading on, there was an agreed moratorium on any form of visibility or public conversation around it. It was just the process of gathering information and doing that in a way that was not judgmental. It was not sort of analyzing the information. It was just gathering resource materials. And over time, within that group that was operating in completely different political, cultural context on either side of this divide, very isolated from one another, barely any contact. Over time, that group, through its dialogue and through working together on these materials, came to a point where they could start talking about how do we use these to enable a different sort of conversation, and to start very slowly and very carefully to push at the margins. But sometimes you have to accept that the impact you will have will be minimal, and that it takes a huge amount of time. And just a final word on your question, Andre, about the sort of policy angle on this. I do think that it's really important also that we are honest with one another about the time this kind of thing takes. It can take generations, and often it's very difficult to embark on this if you need to come up with a set of sort of agreed outcomes from the, it wouldn't have been possible in our context to start this work if we'd had to commit to anything beyond I'm going to collect some information. And I think, in terms of the kind of overarching donor support and kind of policy enabling of this kind of work, there really is a need to revisit some of our understandings about where we see change happening, how we see change happening, how we measure that, and how we resource it as well, so that things can take their course.
And that's such an important point, Rachel. And I guess in another meeting that we were together, we were discussing this. And again, bringing this to the case of Colombia, talking about the important role of donors, changing the way how they think about it is so fundamental. Only last week, the US government decided to take the FARC off the list of terrorist groups. And because it was for the last 5 years in that list, monies from the USAID could not be used in order to do workshops in which former members of the FARC who were in the reincorporation process could participate. So it was unbelievable. It was like we had so many workshops on reconciliation, trying to bring communities with other sectors of the Colombian state, but you could not invite the former perpetrators because they were still in the list of terrorist groups. What is the responsibility of the donors when they don't really understand that this is having an impact on the change that they apparently are supporting to do? So this is, just one of these elements. But I guess we don't want to monopolize this conversation, and I don't want to take the floor too much. So again, we are gonna, and probably we just want to throw this again. Michelle was saying that she would like to hear from some of you. What do you think about how to create momentum for reconciliation? And we have been discussing also this issue of something that I guess I share a document with you. Unfortunately, it's in Spanish. Probably we will publish it in English soon. The connection between polarization and reconciliation. I wonder, and I wonder whether Michelle or Rachel or any one of you in this dialogue would like to reflect on this. Could we think of those two as part of a continuum? So we have in this extreme polarization and in this extreme reconciliation, and we move between those 2 points. Is that useful, or is actually counterproductive for us to think about particular context and how specific interventions we do could help us move in that sort of continuum? Liz, fantastic to have you here. Please, floor is yours.
Yeah. Hello, Andre. Hello, everybody else. Could I just ask about another issue, and that is reparations. In South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made recommendations to the government which were never fully carried through. Reparations were agreed to take two forms: the transformation of society under the new constitution, but also specific payments to victims. And arguably neither have been fully fulfilled. And I would like to know from, I think it was Michelle, you said that reconciliation was looked at differently now in South Africa than it had been under the TRC. That may depend on different people's memories of different aspects of the TRC. But I would like to know what you meant by that. And it has been remarked, first of all, by Desmond Tutu, looking forward at the end of the TRC proceedings and the recommendations that they were making, which were not being carried out very quickly, and by others like Fani Dutoy more recently, that the work of the TRC never was carried through to the end with its with reparations, and so reconciliation is still, well, pending. South Africa is a case, as somebody else said, Gavin Bradshaw, I think, a case of a frozen conflict in that regard. So, Michelle, I'd be rather interested to hear your views on that.
Thanks, Liz. That's great. I guess, don't know if someone else would like to jump in with some ideas, some comments. Otherwise, I will leave it to Michelle if she wants to jump in, or Rachel also to comment along.
I'd be happy to comment on this question, but it's I don't know whether it would be also useful to still check whether there are any other comments. I've made a note of it, so I can come back to it as well. Mm-hmm. I don't see whether there are other people raising hands.
Yeah, I think probably we are all very engaged digesting all of these ideas that have been put on the table. So probably, Michelle, just take it from there, and whenever everyone else feels happy to jump in and to ask a question, to make a comment, please do so. Also, because we're running out of time, so these will be the last chances. And actually, as we said with Michelle and with Rachel, the idea is to think together, not to just stay us here, and we don't expect to answer all the questions, but it would be really good to hear from you some thoughts on this, because it would really enrich our reflections on reconciliation. But of course, you are welcome also to stay silent. So Michelle, over to you.
I think it's a really important point you raised, Liz. So let me speak a bit both about reparations and a kind of imbalance built into the TRC mechanism, and how the TRC and reconciliation link to wider transformation. One of the limitations of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I had the privilege of working at the Commission for about a year in the research department in 97 to 98, was that, and this only became increasingly clear to me towards the end of the Commission, an imbalance built into the mechanism was that towards perpetrators, the Commission had powers of implementation. It could actually grant amnesty. So amnesty was not a given. People had to apply individually for amnesty. They had to give full disclosure. Obviously, there are lots of discussion as to what that full disclosure entailed and whether people truly did full disclosure. But what people don't generally know is that the vast majority of amnesty applications in the South African context were in fact rejected. I think there were about, I can't recall on the top of my head how many amnesty applications there were, but a vast number of them were actually never eligible within the kind of parameters of the TRC mandate. Be that as it may, the people that did apply for amnesty and got amnesty actually walked away with amnesty. Whereas in relation to victims, the Truth Commission didn't have powers of implementation, it only had powers of recommendation. And as such, it was very dependent on the political situation and on the government to then follow through on the recommendations of the government. And that made it very difficult because indeed, the payments that were paid out to some extent were kind of under urgent interim reparation measures. But even the payments that came afterwards were relatively limited, and they were fraught as well, partly because of political leaders kind of saying, well, we didn't get into the struggle in order to get rich out of it. But that's obviously much easier to say when you live in a very fancy home in one of the posher suburbs and have a seat in parliament than when you live in one of the townships and have trouble kind of feeding your kids. So that in itself was a very difficult debate, and the very question of reparations was difficult, because how do you place a number on people losing a family member or the head of the household, or kids growing up without parents, etc. But that brings me to something else indeed. The Truth Commission was only meant to be one element of several pillars of transformation in the South African context. There was the Truth Commission, there was the Constitutional Court, there was the Redistribution and Development Policy, which was an economic policy geared towards social spending in social sectors, health, education, housing, and there was the land reform. Now, as time went on, the RDP economic policy was within a few years of the Government of National Unity thrown out of the window and replaced by a kind of homegrown structural adjustment policy called GEAR, very much geared towards privatization, relaxing of currency controls to keep the country interesting for foreign investment. What that meant was that the kind of social spending and redistribution of wealth that certainly the nationalists within the liberation parties had been so keen on was increasingly toned down over time. Couple that with the land reform program, which was fraught with difficulties and got underway very slow, and still is running up into lots of difficulties. It meant that many of the other pillars of the transformation agenda in the South African context haven't really borne fruit. And that is what, when reconciliation was initially talked about in the South African context, and certainly when I came to South Africa in 97, it was predominantly seen as something that was relating to national reconciliation, relationship building between former political opponents that would kind of govern together and create an interdependent future. as time went on, it was increasingly starting to be read, reconciliation, as something relating to relationships between communities, but also very much linked to redistribution. And Archbishop Tutu tells this story about Thabo and James, where Thabo is an African name, where Thabo had a bicycle and James comes into the neighborhood and takes the bicycle and cycles away. And with that cycle is able to go to school and get a good education, and because of the good education, gets a better job. And years later, James comes back into the neighborhood and comes back and says to Thabo, "Oh, by the way, Thabo, sorry, I took your bike," and cycles away again. And Thabo says, "What about my bike?" And the Archbishop used to tell this story to kind of say that saying sorry doesn't mean much when it's not coupled with acts of actually trying to make things right. And over time, the prospects for reconciliation in the South African context have increasingly been linked to redistributive and distributive justice. And hence you have young people in South Africa, the so-called born frees of today's South Africa, that are born after the transition from apartheid, the transition to democracy, but are in no way really free because they're really shackled to conditions, and their opportunities in life and in society are profoundly curtailed by conditions that hail back from the past. And that's where I meant that the understanding of reconciliation and that's why I personally have a bit of an ambivalent relationship with reconciliation, partly because reconciliation in the 90s was very often said, oh, let bygones be bygones. We're now the kind of the rainbow nation. You will recall that phrasing. And the whole notion of a rainbow nation these days is very, very controversial in the South African context, because what use is a rainbow nation when part of society still can barely kind of scrape a living together?
Thanks, Michelle. I guess you just, put on table these really important elements. And yeah, I fully agree with the last comments you made. Rachel, I guess I'm wary of the time now, and I guess we're gonna hear you, Rachel, and probably do a bit of wrapping up on your part, and then I will just start bringing to an end this critical dialogue on reconciliation. So over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andre. I mean, I don't, if others have things that they want to contribute, please do butt in, and I'll be brief. I've just been pondering this puzzle that you put to us, Andre, of polarization on the one hand and reconciliation on the other. I certainly don't have the answer, but I've been mulling. Can you not reconcile while still holding highly polarized views? And sort of, I think it comes back to what we understand by reconciliation, and perhaps this notion of kind of minimalist reconciliation being around an agreed kind of social contract to coexist and to sufficiently kind of understand, I suppose, or respect one another's views in order to tolerate one another within a space without violence, or the kind of more maximalist idea of reconciliation, which really entails kind of overcoming difference to an extent. But I've been quite vexed by it. I think it's a really intriguing one to pursue a bit more. And where does trust fit into all of this? Is it possible in a highly polarized environment where you simply don't have trust of the other side, as it were? Can you still somehow negotiate a relationship that is that's moving beyond as broken as it was, and getting you to a point where you can actually move forward? I think it's an intriguing one to think more about.
I don't know if Michelle wants to say something about this, or because I mean, when I'm listening to Rachel and anyone else, of course, we want to hear anyone who is here on this. It makes me think of Andrew Schapp's definition of political reconciliation, when he constantly brings the idea of Chantal Mouffe's idea of agonism. And then he says, reconciliation is not about a deep clash of ideas. Eliminating that actually is a fundamental part of reconciliation. Sometimes is that possibility of a clash of ideas, but trying to find a synthesis that allows them to create a new beginning together. So this idea of agonism being part of reconciliation is such an important thing. So when you were saying about whether you can have reconciliation still in deeply polarized context, made me think about Schapp. And so probably we could talk about a path towards that we are in the middle of a polarized reconciliation sort of journey, but I guess at the end of that journey, if we take the metaphor of John Paul Lederach, the idea of the reconciliation is this journey. I guess at the end of that journey, those levels of polarization would actually sort of be minimized, reduced to some extent, and there will be a higher level of less confrontational exchange of ideas, of views on those issues. Probably the tensions will be around other issues, because conflict is part of who we are. But I guess there is no. The other thing probably, and with this I will give the chance to Pyrrhus to make a final comment before I wrap up, is to say that it's not only about the definition of reconciliation, it's also about the definition of polarization. And it seems to me that there is no, and Gwen Bornier, part of Rodemos el Diálogo and at Merton College, she's been doing new research on polarization. And it's interesting to see the lack of research on what do we understand by polarization. It's been reduced to, in a really negative connotation. And sometimes I wonder if going back to definitions that come from physics on what polarization is in terms of quantum physics and all of this allows us to see that human relations are always happening in this continuum between polarization and reconciliation, and we keep moving, and it's not static. And probably that's useful so that we don't see polarization as something negative, but it's also a way of transformation, of change, of something that happens. The problem is when that polarization it sort of opens the door for violent confrontation and the elimination of the other. And then that would be a good question to ask ourselves, is precisely in that continuum that we always can come back avoiding violence, that reconciliation is an important force, avoiding going beyond polarization. Anyway, Pyrrhus, over to you, and then we start wrapping up.
Okay, thank you. It's really, I'm very happy to be part of this call tonight, because that makes me more than happy to continue trying to dig out and find out how to contribute. What makes me, I want just to comment. I and maybe you could share your views also on this. I suppose reconciliation is an ongoing process, never ends. If we call it reconciliation, it's just the beginning after a blocked situation. So maybe what we're talking about is how to learn to make conscious how to live together. Okay, so that a whole country finds out the ways and the processes that they can put down in the civil society and the political society and management and so on, business society and so on, so that they can figure out how they can all live together. And well, there will be conflict, there will be points that it's not very smooth, but they know about it so that the egos can just calm down and they know that they will find a solution one way or another. So this is just a comment. This is what we say in companies, so that the managers try to make a field, to leave a field of conflict between their teams. But well, that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Piru. I guess I really don't want to bring this to an end without having the chance to Michelle and to Rachel to do a like final comment, or like wrapping up from your part. So Michelle, do you wanna please say something, and then over to Rachel?
Thanks very much, Andre, and for creating this opportunity. I like where you were going with the polarization and reconciliation, and in a way, I think it might be useful indeed to think of it as a spectrum, but to think of it as a polarity where you kind of dance between the different poles and kind of work with, because polarization can serve a function, and a useful function in terms of really surfacing issues and clarifying choices to be made. Where it becomes problematic is when that polarization turns into such demonization that the other's viewpoint isn't allowed to exist, and that the other's presence is seen as a kind of existential threat to one's own presence. But ultimately, we're trying to work towards a situation where a multiplicity of perspectives can exist and can coexist. But there's lots of food for thought. There are a number of questions I've written down that will give me lots of thinking opportunity myself. If there's anybody kind of after this conversation pondering, wants to send in comments or reflections, I'm sure you know how to find Andre, or you can find myself and Rachel online easily with our email addresses. I'd certainly welcome that. But thanks very much for being with us tonight. Sorry, it's tonight here in the Netherlands. It may not be tonight in Colombia.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Rachel.
It's a little bit less tonight here in the UK, but it's still feeling pretty dark out there. Yeah, I just echo that. It's been really fascinating, and I've been toying again with this notion of, if we see reconciliation as something that happens in different ways throughout all parts of the conflict cycle, that links in also with this conversation around polarization, and it's thinking about how, at which point you can address issues in what way to avoid them getting out of control and becoming so incompatible that it leads to violence, I think. And just a very useful reminder at the end that reconciliation is indeed a process and not an end state. And, there is no such thing as a fully reconciled society, or probably individual. But it's been really, really thought-provoking to spend this time together. So thank you, Andre, as well, and your colleagues for making this space.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for coming. I do believe that if all of us leave with the amount of questions that probably Michelle and myself and Rachel are leaving, this has been a tremendous space for food for thought. Of course, the idea is never to answer all the questions. The idea is to put the questions forwards and to continue thinking about this. I hope that the people who have joined this critical dialogue on reconciliation have been able to connect some of the things that we have said with ideas that they have. Constantly I was listening to some of the things that you were saying, and the participants, Rachel, Michelle, and new ideas were coming into my mind. And that's the idea of a dialogue, is also to see your own thought process going through up and down, and when is the right moment to contribute. So thank you to all of you who also contributed with your empathetic listening, with a deep listening, and to all the people who offer some of their thoughts and put them on the table in order for us to think together. Just to say that I guess that I have put in the chat the link to the policy briefing that Conciliation Resources published. You're very welcome to download it, to read it. The contacts for Michelle and Rachel are there in that policy briefing. So if you want to get in touch with them, please do email them, and I'm sure they'll be delighted to talk to you. And also want to say that I put a link to Rodemos el Diálogo. I think I just put it now, in case you want to register for our next critical dialogue on reconciliation. So allow me to finish by saying that because we are trying to engage with different from different perspectives. And today we have the pleasure to have engaged with the sort of more practitioner experience. The next critical dialogue on reconciliation in January is going to be with Professor of Poetry Ruth Padel, who wrote a book called We Are All From Somewhere Else. And we will be talking about the concept of reconciliation from the perspective of poetry, and also with the dimension of refugees and what does it mean to live and trying to reconcile. So it's going to be an interesting dialogue which is probably going to give us lots of food for thought. And for those of you who have been following this series, you will have more and more elements to continue building this dialogue on a long-lasting effort of bringing different ideas together. But for now, I just want to wish you a very good evening in the UK, a fantastic afternoon in Colombia, and thank you again, Rachel and Michelle, for offering us all these insights and all this food for thought for us to continue thinking about it. Could all of you, if you